All right. So today we're going to dive into something a little bit different. Remember like the early days of the pandemic
Oh, yeah.
when like it seemed like the world just shut down overnight?
Right.
Borders slammed, shut travel bans like became like the new norm, and we were all, glued to the news, like just trying to figure out what was going on.
Yeah, it was definitely a time of just unprecedented uncertainty and disruption. It was a
Right.
moment where the interconnectedness of the world was really thrown into sharp relief.
Yeah, exactly. And uh, that's precisely what this book, When the World Closed Its Doors,
Yeah.
by Edward Alden and Laurie TRAUTMAN explores.
Okay.
The deep dive into the ripple effects of those border restrictions. All the political, economic, and social consequences that
Right.
we're still dealing with today.
One of the things that I thought was really fascinating about the book was how it goes beyond just like recounting the events.
Right.
It really digs into the decision-making process behind it.
Okay.
The motivations of different governments and like the often unintended consequences of those choices.
So it's not just like a history lesson.
No.
It's more like a behind-the-scenes look at how the world reacted to this global crisis.
Yeah, and one of the things that struck me early on was how they set the stage by describing this like golden age of mobility that existed before the pandemic.
Oh, interesting.
Think about like the ease of travel within Europe's Schengen zone, for example.
Right.
For those who maybe aren't familiar with it, it's this agreement between 26 European countries that allows for passport-free travel across their borders.
Oh, wow.
It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I mean, it's like a whole generation. Grew up with the assumption that they could just, hop on a plane or a train and go pretty much anywhere
Exactly.
if they wanted to.
Yeah, and the book highlights how this era of easy movement fostered cultural exchange,
Right.
economic growth, and even like a sense of shared identity among people from different countries.
Yeah, it's almost like we took that freedom for granted.
We did.
I remember reading about how car crossings between the U.S. and Canada were at record levels in the 1990s.
Oh, wow.
To think that just a couple decades later, that border would be effectively closed.
Right. It really underscores how quickly things can change and how fragile those connections can be. And that contrast is something that the authors do really well throughout the book.
Okay.
They juxtapose the pre-pandemic world with the suddenness and severity of those border closures, and it makes the impact all the more stark.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of a hyper-connected world that suddenly slams on the brakes. What happens next?
Wow.
I mean, I vaguely remember the chaos of those early days, but I'm curious to hear how the book frames it.
Yeah, the book doesn't shy away from the sheer panic and confusion that ensued. Remember Trump's Europe travel ban announcement?
Oh, yeah.
It was this hastily arranged press conference that just sent shockwaves around the world.
I remember seeing those images of those packed airports with people scrambling to get flights back home before the ban went into effect.
Exactly. And the book details how that kind of chaotic decision-making, while understandable given the circumstances, created more problems than it solved.
Right.
It led to stranded travelers, separated families, and a sense of deep uncertainty about what the future held.
It makes you wonder, if we were faced with a similar situation today, would we handle it any differently?
That's a great question, and it's one that the book implicitly asks throughout.
Okay.
It's not just about rehashing what happened, but it's about prompting us to think critically about those decisions and how they might shape our responses to future crises.
So after that initial scramble, governments around the world had to figure out their long-term strategies for managing the pandemic. Did the book dive into how those approaches differed across countries?
Absolutely, and that's where it gets really interesting. You have this whole spectrum of responses from the near total isolation of places like Australia and New Zealand to the more flexible strategies in countries like South Korea and Taiwan.
Yeah, I remember hearing about those strict quarantine requirements in Australia, with people being confined to government-run hotels for weeks on end.
Right.
It seemed pretty extreme at the time.
It was definitely a controversial approach, and the book delves into the rationale behind it, the effectiveness of those measures, and the social and economic costs involved.
Okay.
It doesn't shy away from the complexities and the debates that those policies sparked.
So it's not just about presenting one side of the story.
Yeah.
It's about exploring the different perspectives and the trade-offs that governments had to grapple with.
Exactly, and it's those nuanced details that really make the book so compelling. It's not just a dry recounting of facts and figures. It's a deep dive into the human stories, the political calculations, and the ethical dilemmas that shape those unprecedented times.
Right.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
really fascinating. Picking up where we left off, one of the things that really stuck with me from when the world closed its doors was how these border closures played out in very different ways depending on the context.
Yeah. You mean like how each country had its own unique set of circumstances and priorities
Precisely.
that kind of shaped their approach?
And the book does a fantastic job of teasing apart those factors,
Okay.
showing how political ideologies, economic pressures, and even cultural norms influenced the decisions that were made.
That makes sense. Like you mentioned Australia and New Zealand's strict zero COVID strategy earlier.
Right.
I imagine their island geography played a role in their ability to pursue that kind of isolationist approach.
It definitely did, and the book delves into that, comparing their experience to that of countries with more porous land borders like those in Europe.
Okay.
It's fascinating to see how those geographic realities shaped the possibilities and limitations of different border control measures.
This makes me think about the U.S.-Canada border, which we talked about earlier. It's the longest undefended border in the world,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So closing that must have presented a whole different set of challenges.
Absolutely, and the book really digs into those challenges, contrasting the U.S. and Canada's responses, even though they share this incredibly long border.
Wow.
It was really interesting to see how two countries with such close ties ended up with very different approaches to border control.
Thinking about those differing approaches,
Yeah.
I'm curious about the human impact of all this. The book touches on the plight of migrant workers, right?
Yeah.
What kind of insights does it offer about their experiences?
Yeah, that's a crucial aspect of the book, and it's one that really highlights the human cost of these border restrictions. It talks about how migrant workers, many of whom were already in vulnerable situations,
Right.
were disproportionately affected by the closures.
I can imagine they often rely on cross-border mobility for their livelihoods.
Exactly.
And suddenly that's taken away. It must have been incredibly disruptive.
It was, and the book doesn't shy away from the difficult realities those workers faced: job losses, exploitation, and even deportation in some cases. It also examines how different countries responded to those challenges, some with more compassion and support than others.
It's a reminder that these policies, while aimed at protecting public health, often had unintended consequences
Yeah.
that fell hardest on those who were already struggling.
Precisely. And the book challenges us to consider those consequences more fully, to think about the ethical implications of our choices, and to advocate for policies that protect the most vulnerable members of society.
This brings to mind another group that was significantly impacted by the border closures, international students.
Ah, yes. Their stories are really compelling.
Yeah.
Imagine having your entire academic future thrown into uncertainty because you can't enter the country where you're supposed to be studying.
Or even worse, being forced to leave a country midway through your studies with no guarantee of being able to return.
Exactly, and the book shares some poignant stories of students who faced those exact dilemmas, highlighting the emotional toll, the financial burden, and the disruption to their academic careers.
It really underscores how border closures ripple outward, affecting not just individuals, but entire systems and institutions.
Absolutely, and that's what makes When the World Closed Its Doors so compelling.
Right.
It weaves together these personal narratives with broader political and economic analysis,
Okay.
giving you this multifaceted view of how the pandemic reshaped our world.
Okay, so we've talked about how different countries responded, and we've touched on the impact on migrant workers and international students. What about those communities that straddle borders?
Right.
I imagine the closures must have been particularly disruptive for them.
You're absolutely right. The book devotes a whole section to exploring the unique challenges faced by border communities, those whose lives and livelihoods are intricately intertwined with the ability to cross borders freely.
Think about families who live on opposite sides of a border, or those who commute daily between countries for work or school.
Right.
Suddenly, those routines are upended, and that border becomes a physical barrier to their everyday lives.
The book highlights some really poignant examples, like the Peace Arch Park on the U.S.-Canada border.
Oh, yeah.
It became this symbolic meeting point for families and couples separated by the closure, with people gathering on opposite sides of the border, unable to touch or hug their loved ones.
I can't even imagine how heartbreaking that must have been to be so close yet so far.
It was a powerful illustration of how these restrictions, while aimed at controlling the spread of a virus, also severed those human connections that are so vital to our well-being.
It makes you question whether the benefits of those closures outweighed the costs.
Right.
especially for those border communities.
That's a debate that the book tackles head-on. It presents the arguments on both sides, examining the scientific evidence about the effectiveness of border closures in containing the virus,
Okay.
while also acknowledging the economic and social disruption they caused.
It's fascinating how the book doesn't shy away from those tough questions. It's not about presenting a simple answer, but about prompting us to think critically and to grapple with the complexities of those decisions.
Exactly, and that's what I found so refreshing about When the World Closed Its Doors.
Right.
It doesn't pretend to have all the answers. Instead, it provides you with the tools to form your own informed opinions and to engage in a more nuanced conversation about the role of borders in a post-pandemic world.
So it's not just a book about the past,
Oh.
but a guide for thinking about the future.
Precisely, and that's what makes it so relevant today, even as we're moving beyond the acute phase of the pandemic.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from the initial chaos of the pandemic to the different approaches taken by countries around the world and the impact on various groups like migrant workers, international students, and border communities. But one thing that's still lingering in my mind is this whole debate about the effectiveness of border closures.
Yeah.
I mean, did they actually work?
That's a question that scientists and policymakers are still grappling with, and the book doesn't offer a definitive answer. But it does present a really insightful analysis of the evidence highlighting the complexities and the often contradictory findings.
So it's not a simple yes or no answer.
Not at all. The book points out that the effectiveness of border closures likely varied depending on the stage of the pandemic, the type of virus circulating, and the other public health measures in place.
So context is everything.
Absolutely. And the book emphasizes that even in cases where border closures might have initially slowed the spread of the virus, they often had unintended consequences that might have outweighed those benefits in the long run.
Like what kinds of consequences?
Well, for one, border closures disrupted global supply chains, leading to shortages of essential goods,
Oh, wow.
including medical equipment and even food in some cases.
I hadn't considered that it's like this domino effect,
Right.
where one seemingly isolated policy decision can have these ripple effects throughout the world.
Exactly. And the book does a fantastic job of tracing those ripple effects, showing how interconnected our world truly is and how those interconnections were thrown into sharp relief during the pandemic.
It makes you wonder if we've learned anything from this experience and whether we're better prepared to handle future pandemics.
That's a crucial question, and one that the book tackles head-on in the later chapters. It examines the potential for a more fragmented world with heightened border security and stricter travel restrictions, but also explores the possibility of a more collaborative approach, one that prioritizes global solidarity and shared responsibility.
It sounds like the book doesn't just present a doom and gloom scenario,
No.
but also offers some hope for a more cooperative future.
Exactly. And that's what I find so compelling about it. It's
Wait.
not just a critique of what went wrong, but also a roadmap for how we can do better next time.
Okay, this is all incredibly fascinating, and I'm already starting to think about how these insights apply to other global challenges we're facing, like climate change and migration.
You're spot on, and that's what makes When the World Closed Its Doors so valuable.
Yeah,
It's not just a book about the pandemic, but a book about the future of our world, about how we navigate those complex challenges in a way that prioritizes both individual well-being and global solidarity.
it definitely has me thinking about the choices we make both individually and collectively, and the long-term consequences of those choices. I'm already starting to see the world through a slightly different lens.
And that's precisely what Alden and Troutman hope to achieve with their book. They want readers to come away with a more nuanced understanding of borders, not just as physical barriers, but as complex social, political, and economic constructs that shape our lives in profound ways.
It sounds like a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it.
It definitely does, and it's one that I would highly recommend to anyone who wants to understand how the pandemic reshaped our world and what lessons we can learn from that experience to navigate the future.
We've spent like the last two parts, really unpacking like the immediate impact of those border closures during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
All the chaos, the varying approaches, and like the human cost. But what I'm really curious about now is what, when the world closed its doors, has to say about the long-term implications. Did those 2 years like fundamentally change our relationship with borders?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the book doesn't shy away from exploring those potential long-term shifts. In fact, it dedicates a whole section to analyzing what it calls the post-pandemic border landscape.
Ah, okay.
And it's both fascinating and a little unsettling.
Okay. Color me intrigued. What kind of gifts are we talking about here?
Well, one of the key themes the book explores is this idea that the pandemic might have accelerated a trend towards what the authors call border hardening.
Border hardening, that sounds pretty intense.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean? More walls, more armed guards?
It's not just about physical barriers, though. Those are certainly part of the equation in some places. Border hardening also encompasses things like increased surveillance, more stringent visa requirements, and the use of technology to track and control the movement of people.
It's like those dystopian sci-fi movies where everyone's movements are constantly monitored and you need special clearance to travel anywhere.
That's not too far off from what the book envisions as a possible future. It talks about the rise of biometric data collection, facial recognition systems at border crossings, and even the use of algorithms to predict and prevent potential security threats.
I get that the pandemic heightened concerns about security and public health, but it feels a bit like we're sacrificing privacy and freedom of movement in the name of safety.
That's precisely the tension the book explores. It raises concerns about the potential for these technologies to be used in ways that erode civil liberties and disproportionately impact marginalized communities.
It's like we're creating a world where only the privileged few can move freely, while everyone else is subject to constant scrutiny and control.
That's a valid concern and one that the authors don't shy away from. They challenge readers to think critically about the trade-offs involved in these heightened security measures and to consider the long-term implications for individual freedoms and human rights.
Okay, so we've got this potential trend towards border hardening on the one hand, but on the other hand, the pandemic also highlighted the need for global cooperation, right? I mean, we saw how interconnected our world truly is and how viruses don't respect borders.
You're absolutely right, and that's the paradox the book lays out. It simultaneously highlights the forces pushing us towards greater isolationism and the urgent need for collaboration to address shared global challenges like pandemics, climate change, and economic instability.
It's like we're caught in this tug of war between our instinct to retreat into our national bubbles and the realization that we're all in this together.
Exactly. And the book doesn't offer easy answers to this dilemma. Instead, it encourages readers to engage in a more nuanced conversation about how we can balance those competing forces, how we can protect public health and security without sacrificing our values of freedom and cooperation.
It's a tough balancing act for sure, but the book does offer some concrete suggestions, right? I mean, it's not just about laying out the problem, it's about exploring potential solutions.
Absolutely. When the world closed its doors isn't just a diagnosis, it's also a prescription for a more hopeful future. It talks about the need to strengthen international institutions to develop common protocols for pandemic preparedness and response, and to foster greater trust and transparency between nations.
Those all sound like really important steps. But I'm also curious about what this means on an individual level. What can we as everyday citizens do to promote a more cooperative and interconnected world?
That's a great question, and one that the book subtly addresses throughout. It emphasizes the importance of building empathy, understanding, and a sense of shared humanity across borders.
So it's not just about top-down solutions from governments and institutions, it's also about fostering those connections on a person-to-person level.
Exactly. Things like cultural exchange programs, educational initiatives that promote global citizenship, and even just engaging with people from different backgrounds, these can all contribute to a more interconnected and understanding world.
You know, thinking about all this, it strikes me that when the world closed its doors is much more than just a book about the pandemic. It's a book about human nature, about how we respond to crisis, and about the choices we face in shaping the future.
I couldn't agree more. It's a book that prompts us to reflect on our values, our priorities, and our responsibilities to each other, both within and across national borders. It's a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it, sparking new conversations and challenging you to think differently about the world.
It sounds like Alden and Trautman have given us a lot to ponder. I think this deep dive has given me a whole new perspective on the pandemic and its lasting impact on our world.
I hope so, and I hope it encourages our listeners to seek out the book and delve into these fascinating questions for themselves, because ultimately the future of borders is something we'll all have a hand in shaping.
That's a powerful thought and a great note to end on. When the World Closed Its Doors is a must-read for anyone who wants to understand not just what happened during the pandemic, but where we go from here. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure, and until next time, keep those minds curious.